Welcome back, everyone, to the Property Journey Podcast, episode 46. Heading towards Big 5-0, right?
Big 5-0, thankfully it's quite a few years before I'm away from the 5-0.
I was going to say, that's an episode. So it is. So, we're nearly at episode 50. We've packed a lot in, so we have. Good going. In terms of things that we've been discussing. For anyone that is listening as well, we were aware or made aware that some of our episodes on Spotify were not working. Oh. So the last 4 or 5 episodes or whatever had not went out on Spotify. They are now on Spotify. I have sorted that technical issue, so I have. So today's episode, Roy, I want to discuss buying a property with someone else, and then what could potentially maybe go wrong as well. So it's geared towards probably people, first-time buyers, couples, friends that are maybe investing together, family that's maybe buying property together, that side of things as well. So what kind of would be the common reasons people would choose, obviously, to buy a property with someone else?
Well, the main one, obviously we assume when you're buying with somebody else is whether it's a husband or wife scenario, which you'd kind of just expect. That's the normal, but probably the direction that we're going in here would be maybe buying it with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or partner, particularly if you're a first-time buyer. So that will be very, very common. The vast majority of first-time buyers, if they're in a relationship, they're buying it with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Yeah.
And then obviously that kind of would be your residential style of purchasing. So the chances are you're buying, as you say, with a partner there or with a husband, wife, whatever it happens to be. There's also then, when you go down the investment route, you could obviously purchase that property on your own, but there is obviously people out there that would potentially buy investment property with their partners, as well as potential business partners, that side of things.
Oh, it could be business partners. It could be a brother or sister where you're wanting to buy houses together. It could be friends even, and we have actually come across scenarios where it's just two people who have met randomly, whether it's at a networking event or a social event. They've both talked about property and they've realised, sure, why not? Sure, we'll buy a house together. I've seen that before. Yeah. Didn't work out too well, but again, that's completely, you could buy a house with a stranger.
Yeah, because I think then those types of scenarios, some people would nearly think that's strange, or how did that ever come about, or potentially how some of these scenarios do come out. What should then kind of buyers then think about discussing before you even go down that route?
Generally, it is always advisable, and I'm probably advising here if it's like buying with an investor or another friend or family member, or if you're buying with a partner, girlfriend or boyfriend, particularly for a first-time buyer, it's always important to put, in simple terms, a mini contract in place. So for any of my first-time buyers, if they're buying in a relationship, I always suggest to them, listen, I appreciate you're in a lovely relationship now and everything's all hunky-dory, but if things don't work out here, it is incredibly messy and costly and time-consuming to sort it out. Whereas we can put in place, I always refer to it as a mini contract or a basic contract, which basically points out, if you separate, this confirms how much money person A put in, how much money person B put in, and basically that they agree house sold, bills paid, and whatever money's left over divided out by whatever ratio. Yeah. It's fairly straightforward. It's a very quick process, is relatively cost effective, and it saves a lot of hassle should the relationship go sour.
And I suppose probably from your perspective, you're going to be seeing this day to day, throughout what you're doing. So, would you say that there's more and more of those situations kind of coming up rather than your stereotypical husband-wife coming in and buying a property together?
Absolutely. And then to go one step further, where it really does, or it really should be put in place, is there's an increase in parents gifting a deposit to their children to buy a property. And in that scenario, just imagine if you're giving money to your child, they're buying a property, and then they fall out. Well, you want to make sure is that gifted deposit protected. So by having that contract in place, that's confirming, right, well, the £10,000 or the £50,000 that come from my parents, it's definitely ring fenced and it's going to come back to them should we separate.
Yeah.
Like I've come across an example at the minute that relationships broken down. We're probably about 16 months in to the fallout, and it's only now been agreed as to what's going to happen.
Yeah. And
it's been to and fro on the solicitors, and probably a bill on each side of $5,000 easily. So there's 10 grand between the two of them just disappeared, whereas you have a few £100 at the start, contract in place, boom, it would have been sorted out within 2 to 3 months.
Yeah. And again, you know, you're saying there about the likes of the legal bill, you know, fighting over that and whatnot, and potentially there's whatever your house value has increased has just been wiped out based on, you know, that argument. What then kind of are the different ways that you can legally own a property jointly? You know, is it just a case of that it's on the deeds together? Is that kind of basically the only way? Or
so this is where it can seem a bit odd and get a wee bit complicated. So if you're buying a property with somebody else, even if it's in the two names, it can be registered in two different ways. So first of all, it can be registered jointly. So that's basically in the two names. And if one passes away, then the ownership automatically goes to the other and vice versa. The other option that you can have it registered is that one owner has a defined share and the other one has a defined share. Now, that share can be anything from 10%, 90%, 50%, 50%, whatever you want, you can work it out that way. Some people do that depending on the amount of deposit that they put in. If one puts more of a deposit in, then they slightly tweak the amount of the ownership of the property. So that means then that is an exact percentage of ownership of that house that you own, that no matter what, you're in full control of it. So that means if you're falling out with each other in a dispute, well then you're arguing for that exact percentage share of it. If you pass away, well then you can do what you want with that percentage share of the house as well.
And obviously you can obviously do that then if it's an investment property then as well.
If an investment property as well, it's very common. Some people would do that maybe just to shift one having a higher ownership than the other for tax purposes, for declaring their tax. But generally, that would be probably a wee bit more common as to who's put more in, as to who's got the percentage, the bigger percentage split.
I might complicate it slightly, but this is then where the argument of companies and things like that there then come in. If you're obviously registering a property that the company owns it, is that where then you're starting to muddy waters a wee bit? Generally
not, because a company is effectively, although it's a separate entity, it's the company that will own it. It would be, although possible, but very rare that you would have a house ownership split with a company. For instance, there would be a couple of circumstances I could think of that you might do that, but generally a property's either in a company or it's not in a company. And if you have any finance involved, you wouldn't be able to split that.
Yeah. And then I suppose then if it's registered under a company, does that basically then your ownership is then ruled kind of by how much you own in such company as such then?
Well, the ownership, yes, just simply the company owns it.
Yeah.
So the company is a separate entity, and if it's the registered owner, then that company owns that whole entire house.
Yeah. Should you always then obviously have a written agreement in place if you're buying, would you say that it's more recommended for people with partners and that obviously aren't legally married as such? Would you still recommend one if you were married, or would it kind of just be for those that have, are not married?
Well, good question. Not to over complicate things. If you're married, in simple terms, there's different law that governs that. Husband and wife law, basically, which says, if you divorce or separate, that, there's generally these rules to follow. So it's probably more so, set that aside, and more so, if I was to list the priority of it, would be if you're the likes of a first time buyer buying with a boyfriend or girlfriend, that would be high up the priority list to make sure that you have an agreement in place. And then after that, you would have, a partner, and you could be with a partner for many, many years, and it still would be advisable to have an agreement in place. And then finally, yes, if you're buying an investment property with anybody else, it would definitely be really good to have an agreement in place.
Because then the next question then was obviously what happens if one person contributes a larger deposit than the other, but your agreements and stuff then would begin to protect you then from that then?
That's where it's coming into, if you don't have anything in place and one puts more in, a bigger deposit in compared to the other, and then there's a bit of a fallout, that's where you want to be protected.
Yeah.
So it makes common sense. If you put more money in compared to somebody else, you're likely going to want to look after it.
Yeah. And I suppose then this is, again, it's an added complication kind of on top of that then, but once you've obviously bought the house together, where does that kind of the mortgage responsibilities then, if you're obviously buying with a mortgage, it's fine if you've bought it outright cash, whatever it happens to be, then, you're not obviously paying any mortgage payments. But if you have a mortgage in place, then, can it get difficult then if, say, for example, you've bought it with someone, they're maybe not putting as much money in as you, or they're maybe not making any payments, for example, or they can no longer make payments, things like that there?
That's where it becomes very important to have this agreement in place, because let's say, for instance, to keep a very simple example, if somebody puts in 10% of a deposit and another person puts in 90% of the deposit, that's okay from the deposit point of view. But when it comes to the mortgage point of view, the bank don't care as to what percentage you put in. The bank can either decide that if you don't keep up that monthly payment, they can pursue either for the full amount, or they can just, or pick both of you. So just thinking, just because the house is jointly doesn't simply mean, oh, well, I've put 10% in, so I'm only entitled to pay 10% of the mortgage. The bank can pursue you for 100% of that mortgage. So you can see where if you're putting less money in, but you're increasing the exposure to risk, how it's very important to try and reduce that risk, whereby you could maybe have an agreement behind or to the side to basically say, okay, yes, I agree to the bank that the bank can pursue me for the full amount, but what about a separate agreement with me and the owner to say, well, listen, you're going to actually indemnify me or cover me if payment isn't made. Yeah.
And that's kind of where I think sometimes, we've discussed this before, where, you can rush into these decisions in terms of, we're just going to go out and buy a house, and we've got our mortgage passed, and we've viewed the house, and we've just went out and we've put an offer on it, and then there's a bit of a bidding war, but we've just, blew the bidding war out of, and before you know it, it's, they're in with you looking to sign a contract. Is these the types of things that you really need to think about before you even go down that route?
Absolutely. I suppose the best advice here for anybody to think ahead would be parents who have children listening, and their children are probably in their early 20s. Because just as you say, some parents are maybe thinking to themselves, oh, my son or daughter will buy a house and I'll help them out at some point down the line, not actually realising that that's going to come sooner than what they realise. A lot of first-time buyers, maybe they're in a relationship, maybe they're not, they literally just decide, they see a nice house advertised and they realise, you know what, let's buy a house. And within easily 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they've started to view a few houses, or if it could be a new build development, and they've something agreed, and there you go, boom, 2 weeks, they're coming to mummy and daddy saying, I need a deposit here. So from mummy and daddy point of view, it's always good to maybe plan ahead, because maybe you are saving for that, and maybe you're locking money away and then you can't get access to it. And then likewise, that's the parents' hard-earned money, so it would always be advisable to put an agreement in place to try and protect it down the line. And again, it kind of falls in under this, and I'm sure you've seen quite a few scenarios of this, especially maybe when it comes to the likes of marriages splitting up, or potentially, as you say, their partners deciding that they've had enough of each other. What happens then if one owner wants to sell but the other one's holding on? Oh, that's great fun. That's great fun. If you've no agreement in place and there's a fallout and one wants to sell the property and the other one doesn't, simply in the short term you can't force the sale of the house. The only way around that is you have to go to court. So start court proceedings and basically force the sale of that house and give your reasons and what have you. And from you making that decision to getting a court order, my goodness, it could easily be 12 months, maybe more, depending on the circumstances and how difficult everybody is. Could be more. And then you've all that cost to it as well.
And again, sort of throwing, this into the mix as well, then you're looking at potentially, the same scenario with investment properties, where, as you've, I think, said in previous ones, where, the profits maybe sitting there for the house, where the market value's increased, the house is obviously worth more than what it's been paid for. One investment or investor wants to keep kind of going. One doesn't, wants to cash in. Is that kind of where the plan has to be put in place beforehand?
For the likes of investor point of views, you should always be sitting down. It's like getting into business. It's like getting into a relationship. Where are we going here? What's the plan? What's the end goal? As I always say, is even personalities. What are the personalities like? Because if you have one who's really risk averse and the other one who's extreme, that generally won't work out, because one will want to keep buying more and borrowing more and risking more, whereas the other one who's risk averse is going to be, let's maybe just hold on to what we have, and then that's whenever the friction starts.
One of them has the house in the middle of a blackjack table somewhere. What kind of then, I suppose, you've touched on it here, and I knew it was coming up. I'm kind of glad that you mentioned it, but that bringing the parents kind of into the mix of things, what kind of issues can arise then when buying a property with the help of parents, or parents helping out their children side of things?
So from a bank point of view, a bank will want to see where is that gift money coming from, and there's lots of due diligence and what have you to go through, and then the parent is basically agreeing with the bank that if the house ever has to be repossessed, then that gift is lost. Because the bank doesn't care that you'll pay the mortgage. They want to make sure if this mortgage isn't paid, that they can take the house, and they will put paperwork in place to stop the parent coming to say, well, hold on a minute, I know my wee son or my wee daughter hasn't paid the mortgage and you're trying to take the house, but I put £10,000 into it, so I want that 10,000 back. That's not the way it works with the bank. There's an agreement in place, black and white, simple. You don't pay, they'll take the house and you lose the deposit. What I'm talking about here is not involving the bank, so as in the bank's all paid up to date, everything's fine there. It's whenever there's the relationship breakdown that then the house needs to be sold, sorted out, and money sorted out that way.
Yeah. There's kind of then as well where you might see potential if property's been inherited and things like this here, with family members maybe owning properties, things like that. Have you seen difficulties with when there's joint owners? So say, for example, two brothers or a brother and a sister or whatever it happens to be has inherited a property with maintenance costs, the kind of maybe renovation costs, things like that there. Have you seen difficulties with that?
I would say probably I've seen a bit of a shift in the trend, whereas years ago it would have been the case that maybe more would have inherited a house. A house is maybe divided between the children, and the children would have maybe rented the house, and whatever, everything was just shared equally. But I would say I've definitely seen a big shift now in that scenario, where most cases the children don't want that hassle. It's just, I suppose by the time you divide all the costs out and the profit between 2 or 3 or 4, there's not really much there. So very commonly now in that scenario, it's just the house is sold.
Yeah. Because I suppose maybe as well, some people are looking at it going, sell the house, no fallout, there's no tension, there's no friction.
Exactly.
It's done, dusted.
That's it.
And they move on. Have you come across, and you probably have come across scenarios where obviously if a jointly owned property, if one of them pass away, then what sort of scenario were you sitting there? I know obviously if they're married, then you're saying that it's transferred straight across, but
depending on what way it's registered, but for the vast majority it's jointly owned, so that means if one passes away it immediately goes. to the survivor. So it is relatively straightforward enough.
And is there any, I suppose, maybe tax considerations or things like that there then when you're obviously purchasing a house together? Is there things that you maybe need to think about? For example, maybe if one owner is a first-time buyer, one's maybe not. Is there scenarios like that there where it can have an implication on things?
Well, from buying the house point of view, that will be regarded as a stamp duty. So if you're both first-time buyers and both of you are the first-time buyers, then you fall into that category. If it's a scenario whereby two of you are coming together to buy a house to live in, and one of you has already owned a house before and the other one is a first-time buyer, well then you have to basically take the higher one as opposed to the lower one, which means then you're counted as a home mover. So you're into a different threshold then. So that's something that maybe you have to also factor in when you're buying. But from a tax point of view, again, if you're buying a house to live in, there's no tax on it, as in on the day-to-day living of it. But if you're renting a house out, then that's a different scenario. There's possible income tax scenarios. And yes, it's always good to have an agreement in place with whoever you own it with, that, you know, who's declaring the tax, who's paying what, who's responsible for what. Because again, it covers you, because you don't want one maybe not declaring it, or not paying their tax bill or whatever else, and then the next thing, debt racking up, and then the other person's penalised for it.
I suppose if you were doing it, it's maybe going to be very straightforward, but if you're, for example, splitting it 50-50 between the two of you, should technically you be declaring 50 and the other person declares 50, or does one person take the responsibility for the whole lot, or what kind of...
It's unique to the scenario, and it's always best to take any tax advice from a property accountant, not just necessarily a general accountant. It's a bit like the legal game as well. You know, you can have a solicitor that does a wee bit of everything, and then you have a property solicitor that does that day in, day out. So a property accountant will keep you right as to, well, you know, how do you do that, and what expenses can you claim, and basically just cover everything for you.
Yeah. Take advice from the experts, Roy.
Yes.
What sort of practical steps, and possibly you've maybe covered a few of these, Roy, but what sort of practical steps can buyers then take to kind of reduce risks further down the line, and take that from a broad scope of first-time buyers, home movers, you know, people that are married, family members, inheriting?
Well, I suppose the risk down the line, if I break it up back again into first-time buyers, the only simple way is you have that agreement at the very start. Because if a relationship breaks down, well, that's, in a way, you can save it if possible, but if it breaks down, that's it. There's no going back. And then if you have that agreement in place at start, well, that's very simple as to what way things get sorted out. Likewise, from an investor point of view, it would be good if you had everything in place that maybe it's slightly different, because you can treat it like a business. If there's a disagreement, you could maybe bring in arbitration to negotiate for you, or you could have it again in the agreement at the start to say, right, well, in this scenario, maybe one buys the other out or something like that. But ultimately, it all comes back to the same. Yeah. And that is not what you do at the end, but it's what you do at the very, very start.
Yeah. Having something in place to make sure that there's something there to rely on further down the line.
And the main thing is, don't think to yourself, actually, we'll go ahead here and we'll get it sorted out in a few weeks' time or a few months' time. It never gets sorted out afterwards. You do it beforehand.
I was going to say, how many times have we heard that before? You know, where
fed up listening to it.
You know, I was meant to get that sorted, and it's maybe 4 years down the line. And they only think it's 12 months, but it's been 48 months. I suppose then that nearly covers the last question, Roy, of what would kind of that one piece of advice be? Get everything sorted at the start.
Get an agreement in place at the very start. It's not overly expensive. Again, depending on the solicitor that you're dealing with. If you're using a general solicitor, it might take them a wee bit longer, because they're not doing it too often. But a property solicitor who's doing this day in, day out will have it done in no time. And the big thing to bear in mind, what we hear is some people think, as I said, we'll sort that later on because I don't want to delay my transaction. For the likes of a solicitor who's doing this regularly, that can all happen
within
simultaneously,
the same meeting.
and in fact, it won't have any impact whatsoever on the time frame.
Yeah. I think that covers that, Roy. I would say a lot of people maybe haven't even thought about that. I would say a lot of people haven't even maybe heard of some of them things. So it's definitely worthwhile thinking about, especially if you are thinking about buying property with someone else. If you're buying on your own, you don't really have to think about any of that.
You can fall out with yourself.
Well, some people could fall out with themselves, but you don't have to obviously think about that if you are buying yourself. But if you are buying with someone else, certainly food for thought. So absolutely. Episode 46, folks, thank you very much. That is buying a property with someone else and what potentially could go wrong. We never really covered, Roy, what could go right.
Well, to finish off on a positive, if everything goes right and you're buying, again, breaking it down with first time buyer to live in, well, if it works well and the market performs well, then you've got a lovely home together, and it should increase in value, and you can make the changes to it and live very happily. And then likewise, if you've bought it as an investment property and everything's running very smoothly, there's more opportunities there. Do you buy another one? Do you sell it? Do you buy each other out? And it's all, you get a good return. All
happy days and all sunshine and roses.
And everybody's happy.
Yeah, and everybody's happy. Well, there's a nice positive note. That's how we finish that episode. So it is. So thank you very much, Roy. Much appreciated. And we'll see you all in the next episode.
Thank you.